So this week we're talking about methods and principles, primarily principles, but I wanted to address it in relationship to methods. So let's start with what's the deal with methods? The textbook lays out, I think, a helpful way of thinking about it. And they point to two different methods, historical teaching methods for ESL. Let's take a moment to talk about those and then why we're not necessarily focused on methods at this point. So, the textbook talks about total physical response. If you haven't heard of total physical response, the idea of this one is that the instructor will give, for example, a series of commands. So it might be something like walk, stop, sit down, stand up, turn around. And at first, the instructor does all of the commands with the students, and all the students have to do is kind of follow along. Then the instructor might like vary the order, um, or could even start calling them out fairly quickly without doing them with the students. So different ways of making it more challenging. The goal there being that at the end, the students would recognize the audio signal and be able to complete the task and have made that connection between the vocabulary. A different method is the silent way. And this one, I find this method quite challenging, so it's interesting that they brought it up. But the basic idea is that the teacher remains as silent as possible, and the students actually provide the commands for the instructor in different activities. You can actually build up words from sets of sounds that are color-coded on a chart. And so basically, you do various activities where students can provide a lot of the vocal signals for actions. One of the things that the reading then points out, though, is even though these methods are drastically different, like, right, in one sense, um, they're polar opposites. The teacher being completely quiet and letting the students make all these commands versus the teacher making all the commands and the students just following them. And each of these methods has their own reasons, theories of how students learn. But really, a lot of the content of the class might be the same because a lot of courses still follow a lot of the same principles about how students learn something. So they might start with like the easiest or most frequent vocabulary and work their way to more complex ideas. That could be the same across both courses, even though they seem on the face to differ quite a bit. So we end up thinking about methods often much more in terms of like the format and presentation of lessons, and less as like a guiding principle for most of us in terms of how we produce lessons for the classroom. Because they're not providing a lot of principles about like, content, ways of learning, all of that. Instead, they're just giving you a way of presenting it. So we're not going to focus too much on methods today, but instead, we're going to focus a bit more on principles. So there are 20 different principles. I'm going to give my best shot to go through each one, try to provide a little information. Obviously, your textbook has gone through each one and provided like quite a bit of information about each one so that you can feel a bit more comfortable with it as you move into your next activity. So let's start with frequency. The basic idea of frequency is that a language course should provide the best possible coverage of language in use through the inclusion of terms that occur frequently in the language so that learners get the best return for their learning effort. So the basic idea here is there are a small number of high frequency items that give students a lot of access to things that they read or hear. So things like common pronouns, sometimes the most used like to be and to have type verbs, they give students a lot of purchase in terms of what they can comprehend. And so those are really important to hit. Then on the flip side of that, when you hit some of those low frequency items, you shouldn't focus on those because if you focus on those, they're probably going to forget them before they ever see that low frequency item again. Now, your textbook does provide on page 41 a few different options for checking frequency so that you can see if you've compiled something that is useful or actually targeting the high frequency to low frequency words. Okay. The next one is strategies and autonomy. Basically, a language course isn't just training students in language, but should also train them in how to learn a language so that they can become effective and independent learners. Now, this could mean things like when you're about to read something, practicing prediction skills based off of the title. It could mean note-taking strategies. It could talk about inferring vocab. And then also, in terms of fostering autonomy, we want to help students think about their goals, what kind of things help them reach those goals, and so on. The next principle is spaced retrieval. Learners should have increasingly spaced, repeated opportunity to give attention to wanted items in a variety of contexts. In this case, often what we do as teachers is we create a lesson on something and we have students practice with it over and over and over again until they start to feel comfortable with it. But then what often happens is we walk away from that topic. We go on to something else. Well, the principle here is saying we need to come back to it regularly, and those intervals between the spaces can get more and more drawn out, but we need to come back to those items or students will prune them because they're not important. The next one is the language system. So this one says the language focus of a course needs to be on generalizable features of the language system. The basic gist here is focus on things that they can use. Again, this could be the high frequency vocabulary, right? Like in the frequency principle. It could mean things like frequent structures that they'll see. It could mean discourse topics or types that they will see frequently. However, it can mean other things like kind of about strategies in a sense. So often we ask questions to check learners' comprehension of readings. And unfortunately, what we tend to focus on is understanding like those low frequency words. Instead, it's better to ask things that push students to make use of like cohesive devices, prediction clues, and all of that, because that's something that if they can understand how a cohesive device works, right? If they see it again in another topic, another completely different reading, they will understand that relationship. The next topic is, or idea is keep moving forward. A language course should progressively cover useful language items, skills, or strategies. So probably the most useful thing here would be to, first of all, lay out your goals and then start trying to match up learning tasks or learning activities that you're thinking of using to those goals and make sure that each item is consistently building and helping students move on to the next goal or topic. Principle 6 is teachability. The teaching of language items should take account of the most favorable teaching or most favorable sequencing of those items and should take account of when learners are most ready to learn them. So the idea here, and this is something that if you're not in looking at language acquisition is it's still relevant, but it functions a little differently. We have done research that shows that students will consistently move through structures in predictable ways. For example, and we can take an example from children, but this also works often with adults, just the orders might be slightly different. But for children, for example, when they want to express a negative idea, the first thing they learn is the word no. And it's not until much later that they learn things like never, okay, not, and those other words. So just one example of a clear order. Well, we know that there are orders for what students can learn, and Peinemann and Johnston in 1987 made one list of such structures. The textbook tries to lay out quite a few of them on page 46. Now, once you have a sense of what the items are that students can learn over time, then in theory, you would not start with something at the bottom of the list. Like the last thing that they're going to learn shouldn't be the first thing that you start with. Instead, your teaching should try to target the different levels that students are at and what's going to come immediately next in order to help them acquire the next thing that they're developmentally prepared for. Okay, the next one is learning burden. The course should help learners to make the most effective use of previous knowledge. So for this one, learning a language can be quite overwhelming. And one of the things that we can do is try to help students make use of previous languages that they've learned, or perhaps even other skills that are useful in order to address language learning tasks. So for example, the textbook talks about reading that students are doing in Italian. And what they've done is, in terms of utilizing new vocabulary, they've relied heavily on cognates. So cognates are words that sound kind of the same across languages and often then share a meaning or related meaning so that you can make a guess. There can be false cognates, of course, and those trick you. You think you've got the meaning, but then it means something different. But this reading in Italian, then, as they encounter this new word, they can make appropriate guesses. And that helps them. It makes them feel like they're accomplishing quite a bit. They're learning vocabulary, what the word looks like in Italian as they read. And so that's one way of decreasing the burden. So finding ways to help students is useful. Okay, the next principle is interference. Basically, the idea for this one is ideas that are indirectly associated, often in a positive relationship, are learned more effectively if they're actually learned at the same time. However, if they're too close, like they're near synonyms, it's really tricky to learn them at the same time. It's also really tricky to try to learn antonyms at the same time. So basically, you want to have like loosely related ideas, which could be thematically organized together because it helps them remember the word in relationship, you know. However, you wouldn't probably want to try to do every vocab word, including like antonyms. I was trying to think of an example of this one, and perhaps one way of talking about it would be to do a lesson on restaurants or something, and you're talking about, oh gosh, you're talking about like chicken and pasta and all these different things. And maybe you wouldn't want to give students every single name for every single pasta, right? Like spaghetti versus penne versus farfalla. Okay, because those are too close. They're all pastas. They're just slightly different shapes. You probably wouldn't want to get into that, even if students were fairly ready to handle new vocabulary. Why put those together in a lesson? Instead, labeling that as like pasta would be a useful start, and then focusing on the things that are maybe going to be featured in the meal together, but are different is useful. I hope that helps make some sense of it. Okay, so that is all of the ones for content and sequencing. Let's move on to then format and presentation. The first one for format and presentation is focusing on motivation. So as much as possible, learners should be interested and excited about learning the language, and they should come to value this learning. Now, there's lots of ways we can talk about motivation. So we can talk about intrinsic motivation, which is something that springs from within because you like enjoy learning, enjoy that subject, versus something that's extrinsic, which often means you're some kind of outside pressure on you to learn something. So maybe you're forced to take a class to graduate. Maybe you want to get a good grade. So something from outside. We know that students can have multiple motivations at the same time. So they could be kind of interested in the topic and want to get a good grade. So they're not, you don't just have to have one. And what we want to try to do is foster as many sources of motivation for students as possible. So some of the important recommendations for doing this would be like making the lessons relevant and interesting to students, giving the learner some control and decision making over what they do, So not every day having exactly everything that they have to do laid out, and allowing them some choice in what they're doing or maybe how they're accomplishing the task. Another one, and I think this is one that we don't always think about, or that I've seen a lot of teachers not think about as much as being related to motivation, is to set tasks with clear outcomes and make sure that students have a good chance of hitting that outcome. Um, so, if a student, for example, or if all the students, and maybe you've had a course like this at the campus, let's take math, for example. It has a bit of a reputation for being tough at UTRGV. Maybe you took an algebra class and the entire class got maybe a 60 or lower on the first exam. So students are going, wait, do I have a chance to succeed at this? Why am I putting in all of this effort? Instead, we want to set up tasks where students have a great chance to succeed, especially if they're willing to put in the effort. We can also find other ways to reward learners, maybe through, hey, of course they can get little things, but you might also be able to make it a language learning opportunity, like they've earned the chance to publish in the class newsletter was an example from the textbook. And of course, things that make it a little bit of competitive, a little gamification can go a long way. All right, so there are other ideas in the book, but I pulled a few of them. The next one is about equivalent balance of your 4 strands. So you want an even balance of meaning-focused input and meaning-focused output. Okay, so basically where the student is listening to something and producing output that is focused on actually creating something meaningful, right? Some kind of message. However, you also want to include language-focused learning, so focusing on the language itself, as well as fluency activities. And I think that this is really relevant given that we're doing communicative, as a field, we're moving towards communicative language teaching, which the emphasis is on getting students to communicate. And I think that's actually great that we need to keep pushing to make sure that teachers are incorporating communicative activities, but it gives us a great little guideline for, okay, well, if you divide those 4 into quarters, you spend about 25% of your time on each one of those. It'll help students in the long run. The next one is comprehensible input. So there should be lots of chances or lots of chances or sources for interesting, comprehensible, receptive activity in both listening and reading. And so one of the things that it points out is that research suggests that we can drill students on things like vocab. We can, do all these practice activities. But if students aren't into it, they are not going to learn as much. And so in this example of the Fijian learners, they took drill-based learning and turned it into basically these students reading children's books in the language. And they found that basically the students almost doubled the amount that they were able to accomplish. So instead of making 8 months of progress in 8 months, they made 15 months of progress in 8 months. So when you're thinking about implementing this, you're thinking, how do I get students to do lots of quantity? And it doesn't have to be like constantly quizzed. It can be kind of for fun type reading or listening. So you want the quantity. You also need to make sure that there's some way of controlling for the level. If they're trying to read things that are really too hard, they might not be getting as much out of it. If it's too easy, obviously, they might not be getting much out of it either. So we're trying to hit a reasonable level of materials. Now, of course, teachers cannot necessarily provide an entire library for their class. Now, if you have a school library, many schools do, you can send students out to go get things at the library. However, that's not always the case. So especially if you teach in another country or in like a volunteer type of situation, you might not have easy library access. So some of the ideas that it has would be to get each learner to buy a book, and then they take turns reading the different books that each student bought. Another idea, if you only have one book, was to put it in a glass covered case, almost like it's a book at a museum. And each day you turn a single page so the students can read those 2 facing pages each day. And so over the course of, gosh, it depends how long the story is, a month, maybe an entire school year, they read an entire story. Okay, one thing that they note on this one is that often teachers understand that this quantity-based learning, where you're just getting lots of input, is useful, but that it fails a little bit. And so some of the things that you have to consider if you're interested in this is how to encourage those types of activities, how to make sure that the teacher has access to those types of materials, and so on. Okay, our next one is fluency. Language course should provide activities aimed at increasing fluency. Fluency activities do not focus on trying to make students learn a whole bunch of new information and also use it quickly. Instead, fluency activities are supposed to try to take stuff that students have already learned, they have somewhere in their knowledge base, and then work on allowing them to use it and apply it much more quickly. Often fluency can compete with accuracy, so we're trying to give them all these chances to improve their fluency while then building back in accuracy so that they can exist at the same time. If you're, when you're interested in this principle, then you're basically just looking through the class period and making sure that there are plenty of fluency activities, which would be about a fourth of the course according to this principle. The next one is output. So learners should be pushed to produce language in both speaking and writing over a range of discourse types. Again, here, and this is kind of related to the four strands, the fluency, the output, we're trying to make a mix of what's going on in the classroom. And so they're recommending that, based on research, that about 25% of the course focuses on getting students to produce something, whether it's spoken or written. The next one is deliberate learning. And this is where we get into the language-focused learning, whether it's in the sound system, vocabulary, grammar, or discourse areas. So some examples of language-focused learning could be doing things like repetition drills, maybe focusing on pronunciation, sentence completion activities, focusing on grammar, doing flashcards for learning vocabulary. So all of those are deliberate learning activities. Now, again, it should only be about 25% of what the student is doing, but it has shown, research has shown that focusing on the language at times can speed up learning and can help students overcome barriers to their language development. It helps them, basically, with their meaning-focused activities. The next one is time on task. As much as possible, class time should be spent using and focusing on the second language. Basically, you don't want to waste a ton of time on directions. You don't want to waste a ton of time on tasks that aren't interesting and students won't really spend time on them. And ways to help with this are, first of all, to use some consistent patterns of what you're doing in the classroom so that over time students understand what is expected of them and you don't have to be going over like brand new directions for every single activity. Making sure that activities are interesting, but also that students know why they're trying to accomplish them so they know what it contributes to their language learning, so they're willing to put in some work during that time, are also useful. The next one is depth of processing. Learners should process the items to be learned as deeply and thoughtfully as possible. Your textbook on page 61 tries to show the movement from superficial processing to deep processing, but a few of the ideas are things like, instead of translating the meaning of a unknown word, so maybe the students know it in Spanish and you could translate it from Spanish to English, it would take more thought, more effort, if the students had to understand its meaning using the explanation in English. So it's a deeper processing. Doing things where maybe visual aids are available at the beginning and then eventually those are taken away, so the students have to rely on their memory, their ability to process the information. And also doing some of those predictive things like anticipating what will come next and basically trying to use their mind a bit more than just, being a blank space that's filled up with vocab that's like drilled or something. You want to get them to think about it. Okay. Um, for the next one, we want to talk about integrative motivation. And basically, we want students to have favorable attitudes to the language, the users of the language, them using the language, and the teacher's skill in teaching the language. So that's a whole lot of stuff. Some of the important ideas. I mean, I think we often think about offering rewards and grades in a motivating manner, but also to make sure that you've got a learner group that's kind of cohesive. They're working towards the same goals, trying to get everybody basically on track for where you're trying to head. Making sure the learners think they can be successful. Making the teaching materials relevant. Then working to make learning stimulating and enjoyable. And working to maintain or allowing learners to maintain a positive social image, so not shaming them or embarrassing them as much as possible. Okay, moving on, we've got learning style. There should be an opportunity for learners to work with their learning style in ways that most suit their individual learning style. So things like group size, do they like to work individually with other learners? Do they like to work slowly or at a fast, intensive pace? What kind of medium do they like to work in? All of these are different preferences, and giving students options where you can to allow them to work in their different learning styles is useful. Okay, we only have two more. The final two are about monitoring assessment. So the first one is that analysis should be ongoing. So the selection, gradation, presentation, and assessment of the material in the language course should be based on a careful consideration of the learners, the teaching conditions, and the time and resources available. And this should keep going. So not just at the beginning, but after each unit, maybe even every day, you should be thinking about student needs and the environment as a teacher or curriculum designer. And then finally, feedback. So learners need to get a lot of feedback in order to be able to improve the quality of their language use. Now, we can have activities where learners monitor themselves, right? This can be useful. You've got to be very careful about it, make sure that they have the skills needed to be able to go back and look at something that maybe they've produced. Learners can also provide feedback to each other. Okay, this is particularly useful especially if you can make groups sometimes where you've got more skilled and less skilled learners. The more skilled learners often learn better by teaching or helping the weaker students. And the weaker students have this chance to get increased feedback on their production. And then finally, the teacher can also provide feedback. And there's lots of different things that the teacher could focus on. It could be the result or the product of the communication, or it could be, the process. Okay. So these are the 20 principles. And this is a lot of principles. I think as teachers, we actually make use of a lot of these principles as we're working through something. We're kind of intuitively making use of them, if not not always obviously thinking about them. As we move forward, though, as curriculum designers, it's important to be able to think about these explicitly and to be able to talk about the ways that we're making use of them. So that's kind of the next stage, is to pick some principles that you think are incredibly important that you're going to focus on in your own curriculum design. All right, that is it for this PowerPoint.